Thanks, everyone. Really nice to see you here. My name is Tristan McCowan. I'm chairing the panel on rewilding higher education. And it's nice to see you all. We've got a few presenters here today. Alexandra Hernandez for the first paper, Nicola Kemp, but sadly not Alan Bainbridge for the second paper, but he's here in spirit with us. Betzabé, Torres, Allel, and myself. And we are focusing on issues around sustainability, ecology, and all of its different manifestations in relation to higher education. And the idea of rewilding that's in the title of the panel relates both to the environmental aspect that we associate with wild, but also rewilding in the sense of how we might challenge and trouble the institutions of higher education and transform them for what is a major crisis that we discussed in the opening panel. And as I'm sure we're all aware, the universities that we work in are all doing something in relation to the SDGs and sustainability. There's quite a lot of attention to it in a variety of ways, mapping work, aligning, even evaluating, and there have been a variety of new sustainability rankings that have emerged, and either within the major international rankers or some specific ones, which address some of the issues that we're concerned about and perhaps raise some new problems around marketization, greenwashing, and the ways that environmental and social agendas become enmeshed with the capitalist competition. Lots of interesting questions to address, and also drawing on an international panel here, thinking about how we can understand these issues more effectively from a comparative perspective, integrating the views from different systems. So it's a huge pleasure to invite Alexandra first, who's going to talk about a comparative project. And we'll go through the 4 presentations. And I think we have arranged for 12 minutes for each of the presentations. I hope I'm not infringing on CGHE protocol here. I probably should have checked this out beforehand, but I thought we can have a few minutes for questions immediately after each presentation, because usually people forget them if we wait until the end. And then hopefully, if we've more or less kept to time, there'll still be a space at the end for some broader discussion. Over to you.
Yes, thank you. I'm gonna share my screen first. Let me go over there. Yeah, now it's working. Okay. Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Alexandra Allel. I am a research assistant at UCL. I'm working with Professor Tristan McCowan in this research project that is called Contours of Engagement with the Sustainable Development Goals in Faculties of Education. We are currently working with University of Sao Paulo and University of Toronto, and of course UCL, to get to know how these different universities in these different territories are embedding the Sustainable Development Goals. We are part of a bigger network, which is called INEI, which is the International Network for Educational Institutes. So I'm going to proceed now. As a background, it is important to know that we know that many of these higher education institutions are increasingly engaging with the Sustainable Development Goals in different ways, integrated them into mission statements, modules, courses, community engagement, and many other activities. However, particularly in terms of the faculties of education, we think that there is some inconsistent work related to the SDGs. Therefore, we're trying to gather the views of these different faculties to see whether they are integrating some teacher education programs or not, how they are being addressed, to have finally this idea of how the SDGs are being integrated. So in this way, we come to our research question, which is how are the faculties of education of University College London, the University of Sao Paulo, and the University of Toronto engaging with the Sustainable Development Goals? As a method, these 3 universities are working together. We are working together to explore and have a similar data collection process to kind of have similar views and compare how we are understanding the sustainable development goals and sustainability issues from these different perspectives. So that's why all of these three institutions are doing a data collection corresponding to a documentary analysis, a staff and academics interviews, and also focus groups with the students. In IOE, the Institute of Education at UCL, where I'm leading the research, 9 interviews have been conducted with research, academics, and staff. And also, we have done 3 focus groups with undergraduate and postgraduate students. In the University of Toronto, a similar process with a similar sample has been conducted as well. And in University of Sao Paulo, they are still in an ongoing data collection process. So we don't have yet all those data. Regarding University College of London, and particularly the Institute of Education, we know that UCL is committed to addressing global challenges through education, as well as research, innovation, aligning its work with its broader sustainability initiative, which is Sustainable UCL Strategy. And this strategy responds directly to the challenging times that we have in our work today, and in a way that we can position UCL as a leading institution towards sustainability and social and economic challenges. In this way, there are many initiatives happening around this sustainable strategy. One of them is Sustainable UCL, which is a strategy that drives sustainability through initiatives like Positive Climate, The Loop, Wild Bloomsbury, and all of these different initiatives are working within the university and their different campuses to reduce carbon emissions, to reduce waste, and improve biodiversity in their campuses. It's also integrated sustainability into education and aims for a net zero carbon by 2030, supported by the Climate Hub and ESD steering group. In addition to that, we have a huge initiative in terms of research, which is called UCL's Grand Challenges. These are interdisciplinary research initiatives which are gathering main topics that are quite related to the Sustainable Development Goals, but these topics are themes like mental and well-being, climate crisis, justice and equality, among others. And all these main themes and global challenges are gathering different experts from UCL, from different faculties, to improve interconnection between departments and improve research between disciplines. We also have an SDGs initiative at UCL, which is focusing on maximizing the impact of the SDGs through teaching, research, and partnerships, tracking progress via annual reports, like this one showing here. And in addition to that, we also have many student-oriented initiatives, such as volunteering projects, a Student Sustainability Ambassadors Program, which is voluntary, an optional course for students to engage with sustainability topics as well, among other initiatives. As for the Institute of Education particularly, we have some research centers who are working specifically in sustainability and education, such as the Center for Climate Change and Sustainability Education and the Development Education Research Center. And all of these are working towards global learning, focusing on climate, education, sustainable development. However, we don't see a direct link with the SDGs. There are many other initiatives happening in IOE specifically. For example, there are 2 online modules for teachers, which are called Educating for Sustainable Development in Schools and Universities, and another one called Global Education for Teachers, which is being led by the Development Education Research Center. And those are free courses that everyone can take. And we also have a new bachelor's program that is being launched this year, September 2025, that is called Youth, Society, and Sustainable Futures. So we also are changing how to embed sustainability into the bachelor's program. According to the University of Toronto and the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, OIC, there is a different view where the main activities regarding sustainability and education happen at the institute level itself. So for example, in terms of strategies, there is an OEC Climate Action Advisory Committee that is providing advice to OEC's team to embed sustainability into the Institute's teaching, research, and advocacy. There is also a sustainability and climate plan that serves as a framework for the Institute's activities, and many other activities related to sustainability and in terms of a strategic plans to kind of coordinate and orient the sustainability efforts. Regarding academics, there in OEC University of Toronto, there are many modules and programs related to education and sustainability, as for example, an specialization in environmental studies and the Master of Teaching program, including a mandatory environmental and sustainability education module. And there's also a total of 20 modules on education and environmental and sustainability education, climate justice, land-based learning, and among other topics. In terms of activities at OEC, there is a sustainability and climate action network that coordinates most of the activities in OEC specifically regarding sustainability and education, including conferences, modules, events, including many other initiatives as well. And in terms of research, there is a group of 9 faculty members explicitly conducting research on sustainability, climate justice, and environmental and sustainability education. Now going to University of Sao Paulo and its Faculty of Education, as I mentioned before, they are still in the ongoing process of data collection. However, we can say that from their view of sustainability and its connection to education, they have a huge focus on addressing the challenges posed by intensifying climate emergencies, environmental racism, and inequalities. Also, considering the territory itself and that this university is in Sao Paulo, Brazil, they highlight the importance of contributing to processes of mitigation, adaptation, and ecological transition with climate justice that consider gender, race, income, and other markers of inequality. In terms of the findings at UCL, I'm only going to talk about the findings at UCL because, as I mentioned before, University of Toronto and University of Sao Paulo are still in the process of collecting the data and going through the findings. But as for the UCL research, we can say after conducting these 9 interviews with academics and staff at IOE specifically, and students from undergraduate and postgraduate programs, that everyone, including all of these views, value the Sustainable Development Goals as a guiding framework in terms of sustainability and embedding these topics in the curriculum. They value specifically that the SDGs can help us to go through the challenges of our times. And as well, they still mention that despite they have a huge importance in terms of being an international framework, the SDGs has huge gaps, or they need to be addressed critically so we can actually think about how the SDGs are being applied in different contexts. Because we can see that maybe they are not really connecting with different realities, so therefore we need to embed them in each context. In terms of academics and staff connection to the SDGs, most of the academics and staff interview mentioned that their roles and the particular activities, research, and engagement they have within the IOE is completely related to one or more SDGs. So they recognize that their role is quite connected to the SDGs. And they think also that their research and activities at IOE are actually contributing to address social, environmental, and economic challenges. In terms of the link of the SDGs with economic development, it was also stated from many of the interviewees that there is a huge problem with the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework in terms that sometimes is mostly related to economic development, or that's what they mention. So we need to be aware that many times the SDGs can be used as a framework that validates economic development at any cost. So therefore, it is important to critically think about the SDGs and engage with them, thinking that at the end they are not, well, they cannot validate every economic development. And finally, we need an improved collaboration between academics and IOE staff, collaboration that can help work between departments, because that is lacking. There are many small initiatives happening at IOE, however, no collaboration between departments. There's also the importance of raising awareness of the SDGs, but not only that, not only talking about the SDGs theoretically speaking, but also towards action. And finally, in terms of student participation in SDGs initiatives, we saw that most of the students knew about many sustainability-related initiatives at IOE and UCL. However, they don't engage with these initiatives if they are not interested in them. So we have a huge gap there into how to integrate and involve more students into these topics.
You said in the end, like some of the people that you were interviewing that they were like kind of like, okay, like we kind of embrace these sustainable goals for things that we do, but there were also some like issues in terms of like, oh, maybe this is not like too sustainable because it's very based on economic growth and all that kind of thing. So when you were talking about that, did they kind of show any other alternative or how they can kind of maybe also talk about that in the practices that they do, or how they are doing that kind of refusing but still working with that?
Yeah, I think most of the interviewees say that, as I mentioned as well, they value the SDGs as a common framework, an international framework, and that's why we also use the SDGs for University of Toronto, University of Sao Paulo, and UCL, because it's an international validated framework. But as well, they were saying that the only way to connect with the SDGs is connecting with this framework in a critical way, to actually think what it means to, I don't know, work for no poverty, how we can tackle that. Is it feasible or not? So they were saying that at the end, there's no like a proper answer to this, but rather showing all the data and also different frameworks as well. So students can critically think about them and not have them as a Bible basically, but rather like interact with them and engage with them in a more critical way.
Okay, thank you so much for making this up. My question goes first. No, my question is related to students.
Mm-hmm.
You know that every single year, many international students come and they leave.
Mm-hmm.
And they spend a lot of time in the university and they use the infrastructure. But how do you think, or how can you make these more visible? Because there's the percentage of students compared to the undergrads is just increasing, the postgraduate students. And most of them, they don't know about this. How can you make, or what do you think would be this more visible, just to make sustainable? Because there is a lot of information on the websites of different universities, right? But how can you make this like something tangible for the students who come from different countries and they see sustainability in different ways?
Yeah, I think, well, many students actually from the focus groups never heard before about the SDGs. So during the focus group, we needed to go through them again and to show them how they work and how they were stated like many years ago. But yeah, there is a huge gap still coming from these privileged universities, I will say, and still many students don't interact with the SDGs, or maybe they heard about the SDGs before, but they don't have any particular motivation or interest into engaging with them more actively. So in terms of UCL, we have some initiatives as the Student Sustainability Ambassadors Program, many volunteering projects, but at the end, it depends on the willingness of each student. So we have a huge gap there. How do we engage the students who are actually not interested and which are like the majority of the students that come to study over here, right? So I know that in September, for the new generations that are coming to UCL, there's going to be a voluntary course that is going to be offered for students to engage with sustainability topics. However, it's still voluntary. And I know it's been like a discussion against if we should put mandatory modules or not regarding sustainability. But I do believe that's the only way, because if we are still considering the interest of each student, probably it's not going to be their main priority if they're coming to a program that is not related to sustainability. But we need to try to make them see that every discipline is connected to the SDGs and to sustainability.
Last one from Esther.
Thank you very much. That was quite lovely. And I was touched personally because I'm a graduate from the University of Toronto, and now I work in the Ministry of Education in Brazil. And I have actually two questions for you. The first one you sort of answered, which is about different departments. Like at the University of Toronto, for instance, I graduated from the philosophy department and then moved on to Boise. And those are different worlds. And I think there's something about institutes of education within universities that are much more porous, maybe, and engage with the outer society, and the others are maybe a bit more isolated. So there was a question about if you reflected on that, but you said something about the need for more interdepartmental connections. My second point is in the Ministry of Education now, we're actually trying to sign a collaborative project with the University of São Paulo to, we are in the middle of trying to widen what the conception of quality assessment for higher education is, including diversity, equity, and sustainability. And so for benchmarking, I participated last year in the launch of UNESCO's, I think it's called CGHE tool, which is a self-assessment tool for institutions which want to sign up for self-assessment and for accreditation in each of the 17 SDGs. And part of why we are benchmarking that is that, we can't just say institutions go and try to get a badge, you can self-assess so you can get it accredited, but also because we try to in our top-down power, we're trying to encourage universities to see, and it goes with this question, that sustainability is actually a necessary requirement for quality in higher institutions. So my question for you about that is, do you know about this initiative school that UNESCO launched last year?
Not really, but I know here, at least in UCL, there is a green impact batch that is being led by students organizing for sustainability, SOS UK. So at least in UCL, the certification is being led by SOS UK, and students from each institution help them to deliver this batch and to actually help departments to reflect on their sustainability initiatives and to not only reflect, but create a specific plan to achieve the sustainability goals they are aiming to achieve. And depending, of course, on their own initiatives, they have a different type of batch that is qualifying like their sustainability commitment.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for. I know there were some others with questions, but please save them up until the end. Thanks very much, Alexandra, and over to the setup's a little bit.
Yeah, sorry, I shared my slides a bit too prematurely there. Well, first of all, yeah, is that all okay? Yeah, okay, great. So yeah, my name's Nicola, and I work as a reader in education for sustainable futures at Canterbury Christ Church University, which is in the southeast of England. I'm joined online, but not in real life, with my colleague Alan Bainbridge, who now works actually at Queen Margaret's University in Scotland. But together we edited a book called Good Education in a Fragile World, which is the cover on the screen there. And that is our starting point really for what we wanted to say today. It came out last year, and I suppose today's presentation is a bit of a kind of an update on our thinking since then. The book was actually written by 14 of our colleagues who work at this one university, all in different disciplines. So there's a kind of connection about that question about sort of different disciplinary perspectives. So from theology through to education and everything in between. It was really our sort of practical understanding, influenced by our theoretical understanding of what good education might look like in this particular university that we were working in. And since then, in the book, we talked about messy margins and the idea that actually, using an ecological metaphor, that what we were doing was kind of doing some interesting stuff around the edges, really. It wasn't really the mainstream of what the university was doing, but together we were people who were interested in this. And so we use this idea of wilding and messy margins. But I think what we are kind of increasingly sort of moving towards is the problem with messy margins is that it leaves the kind of agricultural monoculture the same. It doesn't really make much difference. The good stuff's happening around the edges, but maybe the kind of the industrial system of agriculture is still creating a monoculture. So we wanted to sort of extend and play with this kind of metaphor and thought about regenerative thinking farming as a way of saying, well, actually, we don't just want messy margins. We want to be thinking about how we can change, transform the way that we do higher education. So that's the reason really for the title. And just to sort of follow up in terms of our thinking, since then, we've been particularly influenced by a number of writers and thinkers, which are listed there on the left. But interestingly, I noticed Olga mentioned Vanessa Machado de Oliveira's work on hospicing modernity, and this idea that actually we need to find different ways of thinking and being and bringing to an end the ways in which we live in and with the world. And you'll see that some of these titles are very much kind of around saying, well, we can't continue to educate as we are. The world is not as we want it to be. And we need to kind of start thinking of the world to come, not just kind of thinking about this idea that it could be a sustainable future. So our approach broadly is informed by feminist, post-human and eco-critical perspectives. And our interest is in thinking about other ways of being able to do academia and more generative and perhaps compassionate ways. And our interest here is really about thinking about the responsibility and also this idea of responsibility, which, as I'll kind of go on to, is a little bit different. So our starting point for sort of the thinking really is that we recognise that the planetary crisis, so this socio-ecological crisis that we're increasingly, can't avoid thinking about, and the crisis of higher education are actually underpinned by the same problem, which is that we have an extractivist, capitalist, colonial, and imperialist way of being in and with the world. And these are just some quotes which say something about this idea of crisis, that there is a crisis in terms of the health of the planet, but there is also a crisis in higher education. And there's a whole literature on that crisis. But they're often seen as separate things, almost like we can carry on doing higher education as we always have done. And that somehow higher education as it is can solve and be part of the solution to the planetary crisis. So this is what we're increasingly questioning. And I apologise because it's quite a quick whiz through quite a lot of it's relatively dense material here. But we want to make a really important distinction here and to say that one of the problems is that we're in a state of denial and disavowal and that informs our idea of how we could think about the responsible university. And we make a distinction here about this. But the quote on the left-hand side, Greta Thunberg in her book, The Climate Book, saying, our societies are still in a state of denial. Bazalek and Zabaila saying there is still a great deal of willful ignorance or denial about the extent to which the earth is damaged. Well, we recognise that there is a kind of a denial about the planetary crisis, but there is also, I think, a denial about the higher educational crisis. We kind of think that we can keep on going somehow. And this quote was one that I found just kind of saying, well, actually, higher education is doing remarkably well, all things considered. And there is that sort of, we don't want to face up to it. We're in a state of psychological denial. But denial is a conscious process. It's something where we're willfully ignorant, and that really severely restricts our capacity to sense, relate, or imagine otherwise, both in terms of the planet and also the higher education system. In hospicing modernity, there are 4 denials which are articulated: of systematic, historical and ongoing violence and of complicity in harm, of limits of the planet and of the unsustainability of modernity and coloniality, of our entanglement and of the magnitude and complexity of the problems that we need to face together. Alongside that, there is this unconscious defence of disavowal, and that enables us to be self-deceptive. So even when we know something and we understand it, there is this resistance within us, which allows us to continue in these acts of privileged responsibility. We think that actually that there is a way of being able to continue as we are. So our kind of argument is that this psychological process, both conscious and unconscious, is the thing which is preventing us from imagining different ways of being in and with the world. So it's really interesting to me that my talk comes straight after Alexandra's around the SDGs. This quote on the PowerPoint comes from a report that the Times Higher Education brought out based on some work with the University of the West of Scotland, but it was looking at how effective universities were being in terms of the SDGs. And the thing that I found particularly interesting is that they're talking about alignment. They're talking about the concept of the responsibility, the concept of a responsible university being one that aligns with the SDGs. And this idea of measuring, tracking, thinking about impact, it all sounds pretty neoliberal to me. Oh, 1 minute left. I'm going to have to really whiz. Our sort of suggestion is that the SDGs are allowing a business as usual, tweaking, but not really radically changing the way that higher education is. So we argue for the need for a more responsible and responsible university. It requires us to face up, to see responsibility as conscious and relational, and to acknowledge our complicity. And I say our because this idea of the university being out there, it's all of us who are in there who have to face up to our responsibility and complicity in those entanglements. And then responsibility in terms of growing up. So we draw here on Biester's work about the idea that it isn't a sense of being kind of mature in age, it's about our orientation to the world. And that if we focus on the sensibilities of attentiveness, openness, recognizing this is an ongoing thing, it's not an easily solved, it's a human condition that we are kind of dealing with here. And that if we had that sense of responsibility, it's a form of resistance. Very briefly, we talked this morning about fast and slow, this tension between needing to do something right now, but the fact that actually we're talking about things which are, onto epistemological, they're really difficult and they take time. And And also there is this idea of alignment and resistance. We wrote a paper a couple of years ago about this idea, putting it into a framework called the paradox model. And our sort of basic thinking is that the SDGs allow universities to have a fast alignment, that we could just align and we could do it quite quickly and we can show we're doing something. We are suggesting that there is a need for slow resistance, to move into that sphere where actually we recognise the difficulty and we spend time with this, and that universities actually have a responsibility to create spaces where there is, you do need the fast alignment stuff, but you also absolutely need that slow space for critical, constructive, difficult conversations. There's more we would like to say, but this is our thinking about the model, that interruption, that pedagogical acts, the fundamental one is ontological interruption, so that we disrupt our ways of thinking that we can continue as we are. And I'm sorry if that went more than a minute over, but I'm going to end there.
Thank you very much, Nicola and Helen. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your interesting presentation. Sorry. So I have very basic questions. So I'm wondering how crisis in higher education is related to crisis in environment crisis. I believe that you don't argue that the university can solve all the problems in the world. But then what is the detailed link between the higher education crisis and environmental crisis? In other words, how can we say that the university is a key driver for SDGs? So
your question is about how they are actually connected, because I did jump over that quite quickly. So I suppose our perspective is that we're effectively operating, so contemporary higher education is driven by a neoliberal form of capitalism. And so it's that kind of, and it has an extractive mentality. If you think about, the way it operates within a global context, and we started to talk about sort of the financial sustainability of the sector this morning. It's our perspective that is the same way of being, which is kind of saying it's competitive. It's kind of wanting to get, it's resource intensive. It's kind of not really taking responsibility for the externalities of its actions. And that it's that way of being that is problematic. So the idea of, I think it was Olga who said about needing to hospice the modern university, and I think that's our sort of perspective really too. That it's this form of modernity which is enabling that for universities actually to behave in ways which are not ethical and are not good role models and thought leaders actually. And there's this kind of fairly paradoxical behaviour within universities, isn't there? This is quite a, Olga says she was being radical. I think we are being very critical, and we're putting it out there as a provocation. Does that answer your question enough? Or maybe that's more for another conversation.
Thank you so much for this lovely presentation. I mean, it's really interesting to see kind of different perspectives from the society in general and universities to look at sustainability as you compare in the previous slides. And also it's quite interesting to see the quote from the Times Higher Education, like the emphasis on the sustainability, universities' role in that. And also I think in the quote you mentioned about the impact rating. So I'm just wondering if that's also part of because higher education, Times Higher Education, they publish the ranking. So I wondered if that is also a way for them to kind of promote their commercial products in a way. So it's interesting to see different perspectives. And so my question actually is about, because you mentioned that this book is kind of a collection of different papers from different disciplinary perspectives. So I'm wondering, from this book or from your research, what are the major differences of the understandings about sustainability from all these different departments, disciplinary subjects? Thank you.
So, I mean, I think sort of it is a difficult question to answer really succinctly, but I suppose we use, broadly speaking, an understanding of planetary health, which is that, reciprocal mutual interconnectedness between human and environmental health and well-being as our kind of overarching way of understanding sustainability. And we recognise that there are different ways into that. So for colleagues who are working, let's say, in health, there's a very obvious connection. And so what we're always trying to do is just extend their concern for human health to think about environmental health. And that would be the same in education as well. So my research is in early years, and it's really easy to make those connections. What we found was there were really surprising areas where you wouldn't perhaps have expected there to be such good engagement. So archaeology, English literature, because of this ability to think about what it means to be human. I think if you're questioning that, what it is to be a human in and with the world, then it permits a lot of questioning, which is important no matter which discipline you're in, actually. So that's my sort of broad takeaway from it. And I don't know, again, much longer conversation.
Thanks. We better move on to the next one, but save that one until the discussion at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So hello, thanks for that, because I feel that some of the things that you were saying before kind of connect with what I'm going to be presenting now. So this is part of a paper that I wrote with two colleagues, Avraamidou and Tristan. But what I'm presenting now is kind of like how I have been applying that into some teaching materials in the context of teacher education in science faculties for future physics teachers in Chicago and in Chile, specifically. I don't know how to move this. Okay, so the aim of this has been to kind of problematize science education, the how of science education, and also the what for of science education, to expand our imagination through critical pedagogies of science to attend the world and its necessities. I'm gonna say what I mean by that, but I have been working with a collective of a lot of people from different places on critical pedagogies of science with a Freudian approach. So kind of like thinking on how we read the world, but also how we write new words. By doing that reading. And when we have been reading the word of hegemonic science, and here I said hegemonics and I said box as well, because like science works as a box, so it's very insulated field. It doesn't relate too much with other fields. It's a very like in their faculties, for example, they don't engage much with other faculties outside. So I portray it as a box, who is also there is a physicist in this country, maybe you know her, like Jocelyn Bell. She also said like there is a box that we need to open, so it's related to that. And hegemonic because there are other studies of science. So this is the one that maybe is happening in science faculties, but we can also maybe have like some kind of pockets of resistance in some places. So when we read that box, we see this science that is very like kind of like the expert from the university showing the community how science is happening in this very like kind of wow way, right? And we even have in science education a stand of work called the wow problems, for example. It's a very masculine space as well, where even us as women, if we want to work there, we need to kind of masculinize ourselves to be part of that space, to be heard by other people. And it's also this like it's like their knowledge, like born in enlightenment, with this idea of like, oh, it's the white knowledge, right? When it's actually not, but it's shown, it's portrayed as like that in a very linear way, kind of going over communities because that's their way to progress. So that's very problematic. And a lot of people, particularly feminist philosophy of science, they have been working in the philosophy department, not in the science department, unfortunately, saying how this is happening in science. So, for example, Isabelle Stenger, who is a French philosopher of science, she said, The idea that we belong to a tradition that is doomed to define other people as entertaining mere beliefs or nature as a mere resource is a very infectious one, which you meet everywhere, including in science faculties, in teacher education for science teachers, in the education for future scientists. It breeds guilt and poisons our capacity to resist, leading us instead to identify with the capitalist logic that has captured us. So we think that's how it is, that's science, and there is nothing to do there. And then we kind of like see how science education, which is the education of anybody who is learning science, functions as a disimagination machine, because you then cannot see outside of that, and serve as justification for a lot of different oppressive situations that is very well like documented in the research if you go to see there. So we can see, for example, how science has justified sexism, essentializing what does it mean to be a woman, for example, racism, essentializing what does it mean to be a human, for example, extractivism and displacements as well of communities, because there are some people that is more important because of progress, right? And this is very well documented. You can go to read people from different countries, and it's very like homogeneous kind of like result when we go and see that kind of thing. And this kind of define and delimit how we learn in science faculties, how we understand how other people learn as well, how we understand progress, learning, orientations to the world as well, and what is possible. So we need to escape that box and kind of open that box and not think from like within that space. So I'm not trying to find like solutions within that space. So to do that kind of escaping from that box, I have been working with critical pedagogies, line of Freirean pedagogy, because Paulo Freire said that any process of naming the word, for example, the process of learning science, because we are kind of describing the word, this is how the word is, also involves naming its inequalities, questioning the word as it is, and therefore then the word is a problem that we need to resolve, because we know how it's happening, we know what is happening there. So what can we do? And then we require new namings of the word through new ways of being and doing science education as well. So with colleagues, we have been kind of mapping critical pedagogies of science across different countries. That's a special issue that we organize, and like we kind of like gather people from Brazil, from the US, from India, from Chile, Argentina, a lot of other places, not in the UK though. Like nobody sent any abstract to a special issue. But we have a special issue where we kind of map what people are doing in critical pedagogies of science. And we were thinking about what is the meaning of reimagining science education, and what kind of education do we need in science faculties in the end. And then other colleagues, also part of that collective, they said that maybe to be more relevant, science should be less relevant. And I was just like thinking a lot about that. Like, what is the meaning of like to be more relevant, science should be less relevant? And it has to be with questioning, with the very idea of questioning, because when you question something, then you can also question like the meaning of the thing that you're questioning, like its limits, its possibilities as well, and what can you do or not do with that thing that you're questioning. So like thinking in this idea of the relevance of science is that I have been engaging with another philosopher called Simon Bell, whose work was very influential for Freire, but unfortunately he only cited her once in Pedagogical. But if you go to read all of his books, there are some ideas that I think that maybe are from her. She's called Simone Weil, she was French. And she talks about like how can we like kind of unmake some things in ourselves, in our disciplines, and how we live. So I really like this phrase that where she said, let me disappear in order that those things which I might see might become. So like maybe if we are not like just focusing ourselves, maybe the world can be in certain ways. So I'm gonna explain how I'm trying to put that into kind of pedagogies of questioning. So this work is related to two concepts that I'm not gonna engage much now, but transformative agency, not just as what people are doing, but also what kind of commitments and agendas people kind of take on in their lives, and critical imagination as a dimension of agency. So not just how we read the word and how we write the word, but also what can we do in between to kind of imagine new words, what kind of pedagogical strategies can we use to make that work of like reimagining something and not continue thinking within that box. And working on that, Simone Weil says that maybe something that we should like put at the center of educational studies in general, so everywhere in the university, is the practice of attention, and attention as an act of love for the world and its necessities. So instead of starting, for example, with the disciplines, we start with the words, and we start with paying attention to those things that are there because we care, and that's it. That's the reason why we are doing the thing, not because we want to advance probably like a formula or science particular thing, but it's because something else that then our science can help with that. But there is something bigger. And there are different ways of doing this. So one way is moving beyond the self. So it's not just about us, it's about a lot of other people as well, a lot of other things. It's not just about science, but it's also about other disciplines. It's not just about the university, but also about other communities. And tracing how people has been kind of working around this idea of moving beyond the self, I just took and borrowed questions that people has been asking. So, for example, what is the problem that we are like working with here? Who is affected by this problem? Who benefits from this problem? Which others are absent in solving this problem, and which other maybe we should invite to this problem? And a lot of other questions that I'm going to show more in an example. And also a planet-centered education. So instead of focusing on either like student-centered education or teacher-centered education, maybe that's not important because that's a relationship that happens within the classroom. But there is something else that is out there, that is the world happening, how we relate also with that world, with other people as well, how the relationship means something outside. So move to something bigger, which relates to the third one, that is traveling the scale of thinking. So we are not going to be thinking only in the here and today, but also in what was happening before, what is happening in the future, how a solution here, maybe in Europe, for example, is affecting another space in another context. So how can we do that work happening in pedagogical terms? So I have been working with this recently. I was working with other examples in the past, but this is the last one. So I took a photo a few years ago in the north of Chile, between Bolivia and Chile. That's water and salt, I would say, like water brines. And there is an ongoing issue there, like a political discussion in terms of what the thing that is there is either water or is a mineral. And it doesn't matter if it's water or if it's mineral, because if we said that the thing that is there is water, then communities can use it. And if we said that it's a mineral, then the government can sell it. So basically, I have this discussion. And who decide that is usually like scientists or the government, or scientists aligned with the government. So there's a big issue there. So I have been working with the students on this problem. So they see the photos, they see the news about this issue, and they start to problematize about like who is affected by this, like who is benefit from this problem, and what those others that are not maybe like present at this moment in this classroom could say about this problem in specific. Then we also talk about the scale of the problem, who is being affected, but not just in Chile, maybe also in other places, who is also benefit from this also in other countries. And we also talk about the stories and being asked, for example, from the past, how community live, how community experience water, and how they understand water in different terms. And then I show them how this has been a more transdisciplinary issue, and how this has been discussed in law, in anthropology, in science as well, in a lot of different fields. So it's not just a scientific problem. And then we end up talking about science education, the nature of science, which is where I work, values in science, scientific practices, and what else we can be talking about. It's something that I'm not going to show, but this is like connecting that with other disciplines in the university. So to end, because I'm almost in time, these kind of pedagogies kind of address this idea that we need to break the authoritarianism of the disciplines, but also like what kind of education we have in the university, what kind of science education we have in the university. And it's not like restricting science, it's actually expanding science. And it also shows like to be more relevant, science actually should be maybe less relevant, because then you can see the connection between science and other disciplines and other communities. And also the practice of science can also be like widening, and it's not just like one singular scientific method, for example, which has implications to understand science as a living space, always under construction, that also we can be affected and feel science and feel like this is not okay, this is wrong, and that's also a space for possibility for learn a little bit more. You can also lead to transdisciplinary experiment with other disciplines, encounters with communities, for example, inviting the community members to say, what do you think about this? Is it water or a mineral? Why? To raise also other concerns that go beyond disciplinary concerns or university concerns, but concerns of the world, not of like the people who are just there. And finally, invite us as educators in the university to practice attentive love as a moral educational duty, like what we should be doing instead of just focusing in like science, and that's it. That's
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And it was great to see Vera and Drew make an appearance. I think often my research looking at things like online learning in the global south, Vera is such an amazing person to draw on and things like the pedagogy of the press. I had a question, and I'm trying to work out quite how to phrase it because it's a bit of a tricky one, right? So how do we open up and question science and the study of the teaching of science beyond like the homogenous like box of science and what we know, when in doing that we kind of include promoting climate change denial?
Yeah.
Because if we're going to listen and think and problematize, the example at my university in Australia, the University of Western Australia, Bjorn Blomberg, who's quite a famous denialist, there was a huge movement on my university to stop him a centre on my university, and he sort of peddled around the universities in Australia looking for a centre, because basically what he was going to do was give voice to these ideas that the climate crisis isn't as bad as people think. So how do we problematize and how do we open up all different kinds of voices without perhaps but not those ones?
Yeah. Well, I think that is actually the other way around, and it works the other way around. I for working with a lot of people, like educators and students as well, like a lot of times when people don't trust science is because science fails once, and because of that failure of science, like, see, science doesn't work. But just because science doesn't work like that, actually, science is not, for example, a truly 100% representation of the world, but it's really good, and it can predict things, and it can save lives, and it can do all that kind of thing. So we need to show those processes of science more accurate and also more honest. And I think that if we do it in a more honest way, people would actually understand and trust science a little bit more, because it can also fail, but the chances are so low that the risk is really good, actually, because we can actually save ourselves. So that's one thing. But the other thing is, like, science is also about dissent. So in the community, we also have people dissenting, having different perspectives. And historically, as well, instead of science, we have like big discussions of, like, for example, when Einstein came to this other guy, like, oh, God doesn't play to the earth. I don't know how to say that, to the thing. It was a political discussion of what's the nature of the world, like the atoms exist or not exist, and that has implications for how we live. So if we show those like complexities of science and how it's not just something that somebody came out with from one day to another, people will trust science much more. Not because we said that we have to trust in science, but because we show the processes, the stories, how there's accumulation of knowledge as well, how it's having a lot of voices saying, no, we shouldn't be doing that, but then the theory still remain. And that's honest, that's more helpful for people as well. And at the same time, also working more closely with communities. If scientists are more or are less about like working just at the university, but go to the field, where we have an example in Chile called Cristina. She's great. She's doing a lot of like work with like political engagement and just talking about what she's actually doing. And I feel that way, then people also trust the scientist because she's a community member as well. It's not, they don't live in the lab, So I think that it has to be more honest representation of science to kind of avoid that kind of problem.
So I like your point that to be relevant, science should be less relevant. So my question is, in your opinion, what role that local wisdom can offer to reimagine science education in higher education? Because local wisdom engaged with science, but mostly with non-science like culture, religion, and values.
Yeah, I have a colleague that she works on that. She's called Amy Kemp. And I learned a lot from her last year in the presentation that she was giving, because a lot of people has been trying now to make a dialogue between like indigenous system, local wisdom, for example, and kind of including that into science. But some people disagree with that approach. It's like, it's not that we should be kind of like putting inside science this other knowledge system, but it should be a dialogue across knowledge system, and how we also recognize that expertise is distributed out there. For example, in this case of the water, like the people who live in the north of Chile, they have been using that thing in the photo as water for a lot of years, and they haven't died because they know how they are doing it. And there are some scientists actually working with them and kind of like helping them to make the case of why this should be also considered water, even though it has that they have a different kind of formula if you go and do an experiment. So I feel that that should be the way of working together as a community instead of like kind of merging things together.
So we have one question online. Alan, are you able to vocalize your question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll keep the camera off because I'm I'm in a student accommodation, wrapping up because I'm not feeling too well. I think there's something interesting there about there was a phrase there about "let me disappear," which I thought was interesting, and I wondered if it's possible to play with letting science disappear. If science could offer a bit of humility, and therefore it again, I'm not sure what science is, whether it's a thing or not, but if it could offer a bit of humility and consider other ways. And just one other thought that might be worth thinking about in the context of where science sits with this, and if you reject the science, you reject climate change. I think there are interesting links to talk about how science became a way of seeing the world in relationship to the Enlightenment period, and how the Enlightenment period was so closely linked to capitalism. I pinched a phrase, and I can't remember where it was from now, from somebody who said something like, the climate crisis is capitalism's greatest achievement, which I think is a nice little thing to play with. So I'd be interested in that notion of what might a humble science look like?
Yeah, thanks for that. I don't think that science should disappear. I love science. I have been teaching science for a lot of years. I work in thermodynamics specifically, and I don't think that it should disappear at all. But I do think that there is some hegemonic culture, some values within science, like this arrogance of science, that it should disappear. And that's what I also have been working with this idea of Simone Bell of disappearing and the creation, she called it. Like how, for example, now in PISA, we're going to be measuring science identities. So how people is becoming a specific kind of science person, which is terrible, I think. And I don't think it's helpful at all, because it kind of like validates certain relationship with science as the valid ones and no others. So I think that those things, those values in science, those ways of engaging as still in the ivory tower as the way of knowing that is best representation even of like how people behave, I think that that's very harmful. And that kind of thing should disappear, but not science in itself at all. I love science, so I just agree with that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay, last one then. So I'm going to share a few reflections on the idea of rewilding and the implications that it might have for higher education. And I suppose rewilding, as I mentioned at the start, both in oh dear, okay. It will come back. Don't worry. In a moment, I will upload it again when my very disobedient laptop has come back on. So both in the sense of its literal the links between higher education and sustainability. So thinking about those connections, but also rewilding as a metaphor for how we might think of the radical transformations that we need in higher education in various areas. Let me not try and speak and upload my slides at the same time, but partly because I need to join the session. Just give me 1 second. Sorry about that. That's not coming out, is it? It does say that I'm sharing. I'm in another session. Oh, who am I sharing? I hope they're enjoying it. Sorry. You wouldn't know that I was actually chair of this. Is this the right one? Oh, that's a good thing. Did someone let me in?
It's sorry. Yeah, sorry. I mean,
it's perfect. Okay. So sorry to disappoint the people in that other session who probably graced by my slides. Anyway, so I would hasten to say at the start that I am an absolute amateur in questions of ecology. So these ideas of rewilding are quite new to me, but they really nourished my imagination about how we might think about higher education, which is something that I've been thinking about for a bit longer. And also these ideas are quite incipient, but thinking about two aspects of the world rewilding, and I noticed that Nicola, you mentioned wilding, which might be a slightly different thing, but rewilding indicates some kind of recapturing of the past. So that's one aspect of what I talk about is imaginaries of the past, historical ideas of higher education. And the other one, of course, is this idea of wild, which we might think of contrasted with civilized or some other notion. And it's that aspect which links in with some previous work I've done around institutionalization. I've always been interested in Ivan Illich and his ideas around institutions, deschooling society. So I'm going to connect in with both of those. Now, there are various aspects to rewilding. Active and passive is a binary often used when we think about rewilding in the ecological sense. So passive rewilding is when you just provide space, you leave areas alone and they naturally regenerate. And then there are very active ways of doing it, where you engineer an environment, usually through introduction of new flora and fauna. And some of the best known examples of those are Yellowstone, and the introduction of wolves. And for people who, like myself, the introduction of a carnivore, how can this possibly be good for regeneration? But there are these very subtle aspects of the ecosystem, and the introduction of predators in certain environment has had a transformatory effect. Another one is this Pleistocene park in Siberia. And these quite interesting ideas around functional equivalence. So, of course, we can't really get back the megafauna from the Pleistocene period, but there are some contemporary grazers which can fulfill that role in the ecosystem when reintroduced. So there's some quite interesting active rewilding examples. And I'll come back to this when we look at higher education, because we can see some of these active alternatives, which are rather than the messy margins, are about creation of new institutions which are spaces for rewilding. So how might we link in with higher education? Well, I think a lot has been said just in this morning and generally about the transformation that's needed in higher education in order to fulfill its potential in relation to sustainability, climate crisis, polycrisis, and so forth. So I won't say, I think I'll take it as read that we're all on board that universities need to transform themselves in some way. What might those active and passive elements be? Well, the passive elements might be protecting those spaces within contemporary institutions for the emergence of some of these practices. The active one, the creation of new spaces and new institutions. And looking to the past, what can we gain from historic models of higher education? And finally, this question of interaction with society, which provides quite a break on rewilding. So this is some of the constraints. And if we think about ecological rewilding, a lot of the discussions about you introduce wolves, what about the farmers, that are on adjacent lands? So, and these conflicts that emerge through the rewilding agenda and other uses of land and historical imaginaries of human communities that have battled against the wild for millennia. And how do we reintroduce those aspects of the natural world which we have othered and we considered to be a threat? And we can see some of these similar things in the sphere of higher education as well. These difficult relationships that universities have with society that prevent it doing the kinds of things that logically it might do in order to promote a sustainability agenda. To my mind, most prominent of which is employability, which is this constant pressure on universities as the primary mechanism for allocation of employment in society, both through certification and occasionally through actual learning, though not enough. And this pressure which constrains all of these other aspects. Anything from the historical that we might draw on? So some nostalgia perhaps for the community aspect of studies in the medieval European university, a bit more from the Humboldtian model, which is certainly this idea of the pure university of academic freedom and research, unsullied by the concerns of the market and other kinds of pressures. I think certainly provides a kind of a nostalgic vision. But we could go to less discussed earlier models. So Nalanda predates European universities by about 700 years, was the center of Asian higher learning, Buddhist learning, but also a range of other disciplines, and very internationalized university, though based in India, had students from all over West and East Asia. So we can use some of these historical models, although as we all know, they came with as many faults as they had nourishment for our imagination. So it's a dangerous path, the historical element in the university. We use it a lot to talk about how, when we talk about a crisis, we're usually relating it to some previous period where we think that higher education might be better. But usually we need to extract the positives from the more difficult elements. How about that second aspect of the wild? Well, in previous work, I've looked at how we might understand some of these institutional structures in higher education, which aren't always helpful. And Illich's argument across most of his work really was that institutions seem like a great idea because we have a good that we want to promote in society. And so institutional apparatus grows up around it in order to promote it. But those institutions that were originally set up with positive ends end up squeezing out the space for the original good that was valued. So if we think of this in educational terms, the whole paraphernalia of our educational governance and structures, both visible and invisible, in Illich's view, end up squeezing out the real convivial, in his terms, learning that we should be valuing. And it's you don't have to dig very deep into higher education to see how some of these might squeeze out the things that we're wanting to do. And I've looked at it in relation to three, but this is by far from being an exhaustive list. Of firstly, gates. So the ways in which we keep guard on the people and the ideas, both embodied and disembodied learning that comes and learners that come into universities through various forms of selection mechanism and recruitment mechanism. So there are gates that control particularly what comes into universities, but also to some degree what goes out of universities as well. Secondly, there are roles that are adopted. you're on a bus traveling to your university workspace, and you're a human being, and when you enter it, you assume a particular role, a provisional role as one of the categories of people inside the universities, whether you are you're cooking people's meals, or you're lecturing, or you're a student, and these quite artificial roles will strongly determine the kinds of learning that takes place in our activities. And finally, badges. So I'm using this to mean all of the certification, and most obvious of them being a diploma for finishing a course for students, but journal articles are also badges. That's a certification that this constitutes valid knowledge, and that should be taken seriously and is rigorous and so forth. So there are all sorts of badging exercises that we use in order to validate knowledge and learning. And all of these, I'm not saying, like all aspects of institutions, not all of these things are foolish or pointless, and may have had very positive initial motivations, but end up having a fossilizing and ossifying effect that can then squeeze out and make change and the positive transformations that we've been talking about extremely difficult. So any examples of this kind of rewilding? Well, I think the most, to my knowledge, and I'd love to hear from others, I can see around the room there are others who've got experience in this. I'd love to hear some other examples, but the Ecoversities Alliance is the most interesting example of deinstitutionalized or wilded higher education. There are a whole range. I think the last count there are about 200 members. They might have changed a bit, but a few of them I've visited and interacted with, and one of them is Unitierra in Mexico, which very explicitly challenges all three of those ideas of gates, roles and badges. So there are no entry requirements at all for this university, other than being an adult. There is one actually, because they decided they couldn't cater for children because the requirements were a bit different. That is the only requirement. And being a human being, as far as I know, no other species are allowed in. We might question that. The roles are very fluid. So there are no lecturers or actually contracted staff. There are learning communities. There are people who are facilitators who do more of the organizational side, but it's acknowledged that all people are learners in that space. And finally, and this is the most emphasized element, there are no certificates for learning. So you come out with nothing at the end of your university course other than the learning that you have actually acquired. And this is a really deliberate aspect. And I think, to my mind, the most interesting of how we can try. We're so dependent on these recognitions that may or may not correspond to the actual development that we've undertaken. So this is we won't have time now to talk about all the aspects of this, but just an example of how you can try to introduce the wild there in ways that are very creative. But before I finish off, just to emphasize that this is not the only way in which deinstitutionalization takes place. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the most common forms are actually from a completely different standpoint, from a commercial, technological one, a kind of Silicon Valley opposition to these ideas of very old-fashioned education institutions, that we need MOOCs, unbundling, and we need a new form of learning for entrepreneurs within the capitalist market. So I think it's important to be aware that these processes of wilding are actually much more common from a hyper-capitalist perspective. So we need to keep our eyes on the different kinds of wilding taking place. Anyway, just to finish off then, we've got dynamics inside conventional institutions that might be messy margins. They might be moving more into the center of institutions. And then we've also often drawing on historical imaginaries, which can be very helpful as long as we don't romanticize. And then we've also got some of these cases outside of what we might think of as active rewilding, creation of new institutions, and also spaces within institutions that might be semi-autonomous from us. So thanks very much. Look forward to hearing your comments.
You're very effective in sharing. And with the current, what's the improvement of the research assessment and impact agenda can be transformed? And based on the breaking of the three deinstitutionalization strategies. Thank you.
Well, I think, you know, any kind of research evaluation is, I suppose it feeds into Illich's critique of institutionalization. Because you take something which, looking generously, we might see as being well motivated. You know, how can you encourage universities to produce as much good quality research as possible? And then it starts to fulfill a function which might be actually conceived to constrain that production through various reasons. And partly through negative influences on individual researchers and academics' outputs and distortions of that, but also through rewarding success and thereby exacerbating initial inequalities between institutions. So I think there are two types of distortion. I would say, just for the record, though, that there are actually worse evaluation mechanisms than the UK's REF. It's not saying much, but there are worse ones because some of the national evaluations place a much stronger emphasis on quantity. In the UK, at least, there's not a strong emphasis on the number of papers published yet, at least. Some countries have a massive quantity emphasis. And that can lead to even more distortion of work and time waste. So I think that's a good example of the kind of thing that we need to transform.
Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation. I'm curious about the imaginaries of those universities, of those alliances that are emerging.
Yeah.
If you can refer to that, because what I am seeing and listening, that there are several universities engaging with discussion of climate change or intercultural education of decolonization, but within the same structure, within trying to make it and find a formula. But it seems that example that you gave, the Universidad de la Tierra, was escaping from that imaginary. So I would love to hear about how that process emerged and how, if you can aspire, some of us that feel inclined for different ways of knowing to build that while you keep a foot in these type of systems.
Yeah, I think all of them. When you start to dig under the surface, all of these, they've all got their challenges. None of them provide a perfect model because some of the really interesting ecoversities, they're struggling to have an organic link to grassroots communities. Usually they're set up by well-educated middle-class intellectuals who've then discovered an alternative path. And then they open up a space in dialogue with indigenous or other communities. But it's not organically grown out of those communities. So there's that issue. There are the more obvious ones about resourcing. All of these are tiny. All of these ecoversities are really, really small. And then just linking back to the discussion at the start, because the practical reality for a young person in all but the most privileged locations and backgrounds is that you need to think about a livelihood within a competitive capitalist environment, unless you are actually a subsistence farmer, and there's a decreasing number of those. You have to think about a competitive livelihood, and these institutions do not give you access to that as a general rule. So I think we need them, but we need them along with a sort of variegated, an ecology of lots of other kinds of experiments, some of which might be, more engaged with the mainstream. They're pushing the boundaries within mainstream institutions, but they can still provide the kind of certification that most young people, let's face it, need in order to put food on the table. So I think at the moment we need to be working in all those places simultaneously. Please feel free. We've got 5 minutes left to ask questions of any of the other speakers as well. We can open this out as a general space for the whole panel. Anyone who didn't have a chance to ask in one of the earlier sessions. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation, kind of break up the traditional way of understanding universities and introducing all this wild way of understanding. So thank you so much. So when you're showing us the Mexican university, I cannot stop wondering to what extent university is naming. It's a definition. For example, for that Mexican university, it just calls itself a university, but we can call it a learning space or a collaborative, whatever space. And also, for example, because when we're looking at university nowadays, we're really looking at this dominant way of doing things that has this tradition, as you mentioned, from University of Bologna, Hobotian model. So this is like a dominant kind of way of running a university nowadays. But as you mentioned, there are all sorts of different ways of doing higher learning. So just some thoughts and
yeah, it's a really interesting, something that I've questions also come to me quite a lot, and you know, I do find that a lot of these initiatives do claim the term university because they want to engage in that struggle on the terrain of what a university is. And the most obvious example of that, and I'm not sure it exists anymore, but about 10 or 15 years ago, I visited something called the Universidad Abierta de Chile, the Open University of Chile, which was engaged in a legal battle with the Chilean state about the use of the term university, which is regulated in Chile, as it is in some other countries. You can't just call yourself a university if you want. But they felt it was important to engage in that legal struggle because they didn't want to relinquish the term to other people's definitions. They wanted actually to be part of defining what that might be. Others might disagree. I mean, you could call a lot of these things adult education. You know, where is the boundary between adult education and a university? I mean, other than tautological definitions, which is what most people give, which are pretty useless. You know, in real terms, I mean, other than the issuing of certification that is recognized by a state, which is exactly what you're trying to get rid of in these kinds of things. So by definition, you would be outside of that. How do we conceptualize that? So I think it's an interesting question. Also, the terminology. We have 1 minute left. So any question for any of the other presenters? Any of the ones from before? Yeah.
A quick question, thank you. About as mentioned, the feminism connection with the environmental debate, and I wonder for the Western, the dualism as critique for the class and Aristotle's the epistemology traditions, how to deal with the reconstruction of and assessment of certain disciplines like the critical ecology or critical geographies, and they are not integrated in the values as a set in the like path.
Thanks for that. Would any of the other panelists like to pick? Not dodging it at all, but I just I think these are really important questions to pose, particularly if we are, I think, very important when we're thinking about ecology of knowledges in the institution, not thinking only about the international, but also the intranational or cultural, and the way that different knowledge traditions are submerged and made invisible within specific cultural traditions. So, feminist perspectives and others, I think, very important to have as part of the dialogue in terms of how we might create a plural epistemic space within universities, partly through different regions of the world, but also through submerged traditions within specific geographical locales. Anyone else like to comment on that? Well, I think we've had a full session, so please join with me in thanking all of the speakers today.